if you don't want people talking about why is it that we've gone from 2/3 of us being in the middle class with one paycheck to 1/3 of us, a little more than 1/3 of us being in the middle class with two paychecks. If you don't want people talking about that, then get them talking about, hey, look at that brown person, look at that black person, look at that queer person, look at that woman who, et cetera. I mean, misogyny, racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, all of it. It's all ways to change the subject very effectively, frankly, playing on the tribal instinct that we all have that was a survival instinct for the first couple 100,000 years of humanity.
Welcome to the Politics Chicks podcast. I'm Christy Branham.
And I'm Monica Healy.
What if one of the most consequential legal ideas in American history began with a sentence that the Supreme Court never actually ruled? Our guest today argues that sentence helped give corporations the constitutional rights to reshape our politics, our economy, and the American middle class. Thom Hartmann is a nationally syndicated host of the Thom Hartmann program and author of more than 20 books. His new book, Who Killed the American Dream? The Greatest Political Crime Ever Told, traces the story from an 1886 railroad case to Citizens United and argues that the solution requires changing the Constitution.
Thom Hartmann, we are so honored to have you. Welcome to the Politics Chicks.
Thank you, Monica. I'm so honored to be here with you guys. It's just great. Thank you for inviting me.
Monica and I are both history buffs, so we both thoroughly enjoyed this book. And we want to focus on the book because ultimately this book lays out the argument that Citizens United does not have a legal leg to stand on. So let's go back to the beginning and take us back to Vermont, that day in the law library in 2002 that you described with the smell of vanilla and the crack of the leather book binding as it opened. What did you find that day in that book that was handed to you by the librarian?
Well, in 2002, if you asked most lawyers if in 1886, the Supreme Court established that corporations had rights under the 14th Amendment and ultimately under the rest of the Bill of Rights, or the entire Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. They would have said, yes, that's what happened. I wasn't the first person to make this discovery. A guy named J. Graham discovered it in 1954, wrote a book about it, but I don't think he sold more than 500 copies. I was, and I didn't know what I'm about to tell you. I assumed that this was also the truth because it was in everybody's books. It was in history books. And in fact, in 2003, I've written two books about this topic. The first one was called Unequal Protection, How Corporations Became Persons. And it was a very academic book. In fact, it's used in some colleges now. And basically, I'll start at the beginning here. I went, the story I was going to tell you. I went to after the book came out, that first book, I went to I did a tour of law schools, and I started here in Portland with the Lewis and Clark Law School. We did 6 of them. And there was about 300 lawyers and law students and professors in the room. And I said, raise your hand if you know that in 1886, the Supreme Court ruled that corporations have the rights of persons. And, the same as natural persons under the 14th Amendment. Everybody in the room raised their hand. So anyhow, that book came out, and it helped inspire and participate with a movement, a growing movement, the Move to Amend movement and other things so nowadays, more people are aware of what I discovered than they were then. But anyhow, this is my learning. I was assuming that was true. And so I went to the law library of the Vermont Supreme Court, which was just down the street from where I lived at the time. And they've got one of the oldest and best law libraries in the country because Vermont was an independent nation when it started out. This was there. And Jim Donovan, who was the lawyer and librarian for the law library, I said, I'm looking for that 1886 Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad case. And he finds the old book, the original 1888 publication, and pulls it off the shelf and says, here you go. And I sat down and I read the entire decision. It was about the railroads in California were suing Santa Clara County, because they had a higher property tax rate on track going through their county than Santa Ana County did. And they said that's not equal protection under the law, which the 14th Amendment requires all persons to have or have access to. And it had already succeeded this case in the Ninth Circuit, which was overseen by a justice named Stephen Field. He also served on the Supreme Court. In fact, back then, the Supreme Court justices were only in D.C. 3 months out of the year, and the other 9 months they were home running the circuit courts. Field, it turned out, well, anyway, I read this in the book. I read this entire decision, and nowhere in it did it say corporations are persons. In fact, it said a constitutional issue was raised and we chose not to address it. And so I went to Jim and I said, what's the deal here? And he was like, well, I don't know. Let's check the headnote. And we flipped back to the page that preceded the whole decision. And there it was, this statement, the Chief Justice, Morrison Remick Waite, said, corporations are persons under the entitled rights under the 14th Amendment. And I'm like, what's that? And he's like, well, it's a headnote. It has no legal status. It's written by the clerk of the court. It's mostly there for like law students and researchers. And I said, but the decision doesn't say that. And he was like, you're kidding. And so he sat down next to me and he read it. And he was like, holy cow. And I said, what is this? And he said, well, sometimes the court gets it wrong. And so that was the beginning of my odyssey to figure out what the hell happened. And what I ultimately learned was that Stephen J. Field was being bribed by probably Leland Stanford, but by some of the railroad barons. And they were going to sponsor him for president in a couple of years if he went along with what they wanted to do. And John Chandler Bancroft Davis, who was the clerk of the court, was the son of the governor of Massachusetts, very wealthy man, very wealthy family, the former president of a railroad in New England. And he was in on it. And they wrote this thing, and the clerk and the guy that they attributed the quote to, Morrison Remick Waite, the Chief Justice, was in congestive heart failure in 1886. He died in 1887. The book wasn't published until 1888. He never even knew that these words were put in his mouth. And that was the beginning. That was like planting a landmine, in our political and legal landscape that got activated during the Reagan Revolution, basically, and then went on steroids at Citizens United.
So we're going back, 150 years or so and looking at this precedent that was all a fallacy. Do you attribute that to a clerical mistake? Do you attribute it to corruption? What's the basis of this?
No, it was, in my opinion, I mean, people have been debating this for some years now, but in my opinion, it was a conspiracy. We actually I went to the National Archives, and there's a Stephen J. Field folder, there's a Morrison Remick Waite folder, there's a John Chandler Bancroft Davis folder. None of them, it looked to me like anybody had opened in at least 100 years. I mean, they were just covered with dust. And we found correspondence between Stephen J. Field and some of the railroad guys. We found correspondence where Bancroft Davis had reached out to the Chief Justice and said, what do you think about this argument? And the Chief Justice basically said, well, they're corporate persons. So of course, there is a certain personhood. This was established in 1815 in the Dartmouth case, that corporations have personhood status, meaning they can be forced to pay taxes, they can sue, they can be sued, they can sign contracts. You have to have some legal status. And the argument that Field was making and that the lawyer Sanderson for the railroads was making in this case, when they tried to make this argument unsuccessfully, was that the people who wrote the 14th Amendment says no person shall, not have equal protection under the law, or all persons shall have equal protection under the law. And the argument that he made was that when they wrote the 14th Amendment, they didn't say natural person, which is what you would say if you meant people. They said person because they intended to encompass corporations, which is complete horse crap. I mean, I've gone back and looked at the transcripts of the committees that wrote, both in the House and the Senate, that wrote the 14th Amendment. There's no reference to any of this in there. But they hired these two guys, Roscoe Conklin, who was a congressman, and I forget the senator's name, who had been on the committee. and the railroads hired them and paid them really well. And for the next 10 years, these guys traveled around the United States, going to state capitals and visiting with lawyers and legislators and the U.S. Capitol and whatnot, pitching this idea that they intended for the word person to include corporations, which, again, was a complete lie. And by, I think it's in the book, I think it was 1897, there was a decision where the Supreme Court actually quoted the headnote. And that was the decision that actually became the precedent, because the Supreme Court can quote Daffy Duck, but once they rule on something, it doesn't matter who they quote. And that was when it really came into law. But it was all based on a lie, and pretty clearly a lie that was based on this bribery of Stephen Field.
And you established in the book that the founding fathers would basically be rolling over in their graves right now, because they did not have a very favorable opinion of corporations. And that's, you brought up the Boston Tea Party as an example of that. And you posited very, very rightly that it wasn't, the Boston Tea Party wasn't so much a rebellion against the government as it was against the East India Company, correct?
That's
so
right.
Let's talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, these guys had just fought. There's a reason why the word corporation does not exist in the Declaration or the Constitution. These guys had just fought a war against the world's largest corporation that owned and controlled India and multiple other smaller countries. And it was the largest corporation in the world. Its major stockholders were the king and members of parliament. And it had done this Walmart thing on America, just trying to wipe out all the small business people. And it wasn't just.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it really is. I mean, Walmart opens and 100 small businesses go out of business. I mean, that's the average around the country. And it was the same thing. And there was a severe recession in 1771. And it hurt the East India Company badly. And so they were the principal supplier of pretty much everything to North America that came from the United Kingdom. And so they went to the Parliament, which, owned stock in them, and they were bribing and paying off and whatnot, and said, we need a tax break. And so Parliament, the way that they taxed tea back then, they taxed it when it was brought into inventory. So they bring the tea from India to England, and when it went into inventory, they paid the tax on it. And then when they sold it later, they didn't have to worry about the tax. So what Parliament did is they forgave that tax. It was the biggest tax break for a corporation in the history of the world.
Corporate welfare cleans in the 1700s.
So the East India Company then starts trying to bring this tea to the United States to at super low prices, which they could do now, to compete with all the small tea importers that they referred to as smugglers and pirates. And the people of the East Coast were just having nothing to do with it. I mean, we didn't drink coffee in America at that time. Everybody drank tea. Tea houses and bars were the social gathering spots. Tea houses during the day, bars in the evening. And the tea houses were all individually owned by small entrepreneurs. And here was the East India Company threatening to put them out of business and just wipe them out. And they just said no. And that was the Boston Tea Party. It was a revolt against a corporation. Just a couple of years, and that was in 1883, 2 years later. Just a couple of years, the Boston Tea Act or the Tea Tax Act that happened right around then. Just before that, Thomas Jefferson had written a pamphlet, a fairly long pamphlet, called A Summary View of the Rights of British Americans, in which he was telling his fellow Americans how to be good citizens of England while living in North America. He was not in favor of separation from England. And then the Boston Tea Party happened, and suddenly Thomas Jefferson and a whole bunch of his buddies just said, okay, that's it, we're changing our minds. Because in response to the Tea Party, they imposed the Boston Ports Act, which said that until the local tea guys paid back the East India Company for $1 million worth of tea that they destroyed, they were going to barricade the ports, which was basically an act of war. And that was the thing that triggered, essentially, the American Revolution.
So we're looking at business owners, corporations from truly even before the founding of our country up through the 1880s decision as fighting back against everyday people. They didn't want oversight. They wanted the rights of personhood, as was declared in this decision. So from 1880s to Citizens United, you make an argument in your book that Citizens United is not the beginning of it. It is the culmination of years of what came before it.
Yeah, this kind of landmine in our political landscape got activated in 1978 in a case. In 1971, Lewis Powell, who was a corrupt tobacco executive in Virginia, wrote a memo to his next door neighbor and best friend, Eugene Sindor, who was the chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, in which he said that because Ralph Nader and Rachel Carson's books had literally created the consumer movement and the environmental movement in the mid 60s, that, and this was, 71, that this was creeping communism, and they were going to bring down, particularly Ralph Nader, were going to bring down the free enterprise system in America. And so the wealthy people and the big corporations had to reach out and take control of our courts, take control of our colleges, take control of our schools, take control of our political systems, build think tanks, seize as much of the media as possible. I mean, it was just a whole comprehensive plan. The Powell memo is fairly infamous. The next year, Richard Nixon put him on the Supreme Court. And in 1978, he authored the decision, First National Bank versus Bellotti. There was a law in Massachusetts that said that corporations could not put money into political campaigns. There was an anti-abortion ballot initiative in Massachusetts that year, or the previous year, 77. And the First National Bank, their CEO was into this, and so the bank made a big contribution. Frank Bellotti, the Attorney General, sued them, and that made its way to the Supreme Court. And in that case, Lewis Powell said, specifically citing and quoting the headnote in 1886, said, no, wait a minute. This corporation is a person. It has rights under the Bill of Rights. It has rights under the Constitution, not just the 14th Amendment. It has rights under the Bill of Rights. So the First Amendment says you have the right to free speech. Well, how can a corporation speak? It doesn't have a mouth. Well, it can speak with money. So, and that was, and that decision, First National Bank versus Bellotti in 78, was what greased the skids for Ronald Reagan to flow into the White House on a tsunami of oil industry money, because suddenly it was legal. And then, we've had a couple of decisions since then that kind of amplified on that. But the big one, of course, was in 2010, October 2010, with Citizens United, where they just kicked the doors wide open. And now we've had a few others since then saying, well, if you bribe a politician and you pay him off afterwards, it's a tip. And the Snyder decision, all these other things. But it's all coming from the fruit of that poison tree, that lie that Stephen Field and John Bancroft Davis pushed back in 1886. It's amazing.
And you kind of implicate Ronald Reagan's administration in this as well. And before we get into that, why don't you talk a little bit about the personal things that you share in this story that you wrote about your family, your father as a union member, the illness he suffered, the illness your brother suffered, and then talk about the impact that this has had on a family with a single income being able to be middle class in America, because you argue that this destroyed the middle class for all intents and purposes, correct?
Yeah, when Reagan came into office in 1981, roughly 2/3 of us were in the middle class with a single paycheck. And I'm defining the middle class using Teddy Roosevelt's metric, which is a single paycheck allows you to buy a house, pay for transportation. Today we would call that buying a car. Take a vacation every year, put your kids through school, including college, and have enough left over for retirement. Very simple, very straightforward. And 2/3 of us were in that when Reagan came into office. Today, it's about 41%, and it requires two paychecks instead of one. And what has brought this about, basically, is all this extraordinary power that corporations have claimed since the Bellotti decision, which preceded Reagan by 2 years. And so, for example, you've got corporations claiming First Amendment rights to insert themselves into political campaigns and pour money into politicians. You've got with Fourth Amendment, the right of privacy. Dow Chemical sued based, again, on the 1886 case when the EPA flew a plane over one of their plants and they were illegally emitting benzene into the air, a powerful carcinogen that was poisoning people downwind. And the EPA busted them, and they sued, took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, They've got the right to privacy. You didn't notify them in advance. And so now if the government wants to do spring inspections, surprise inspections, they can't do that anymore. They have to notify people that they're coming and all that kind of stuff. An awful lot of corporate secrecy has been supported by this idea, which is the Fifth Amendment. You don't have to testify against yourself. You can keep things secret. You have the right to do that. And corporations routinely invoke the Fifth Amendment. So my dad, who was born in 29, when I was a little kid, he on the GI Bill, he wanted to be a history professor when he grew up, and he was 2 years into college when mom got pregnant with me. And so he dropped out and went to work in a steel mill where he was working. The hot steel came out over rollers that were covered with asbestos. And so he was working literally in a cloud of asbestos. Now, they had known since 1933 for sure that asbestos caused mesothelioma, which is one of the most vicious forms of lung cancer that there is. It's insanely painful. And it's a cancer of the lining of the lungs. But they hid it from everybody. And my dad died of that. He died of mesothelioma. My brother Stan was a smoker from teenage years, and again, this was, Stanley's just a couple of years younger than I am, and I'm an old man, so this was back in the day. I mean, I literally remember watching Ronald Reagan on television in a lab coat, in a doctor's white coat with a stethoscope, saying, "Smoke Chesterfields. More doctors smoke Chesterfields when they have a cold or a sore throat." So I mean, this was back when they weren't just lying to us; they were pitching us. And my brother just fell for it, got severely addicted, and just wasn't able to quit. And he died from COPD a couple of years ago. Basically tobacco killed him. And obviously it's not just my dad and my brother. I mean, literally millions of Americans have been killed by these doctrines of corporate secrecy and corporate human rights that, again, were based on a lie and a bribe.
Both my dad and my uncle were lifelong smokers, and both of them died as, maybe you can't draw a direct line, but I believe that both of them died as a result of their smoking habits.
Oh, yeah.
And you have made the argument that the corporations, if there's a lawsuit brought against a corporation, their penalty is a fine. They pay. But if you were to bring a lawsuit against a person, they go to jail. So there's a central argument there, correct?
Yeah, for sure. I saw a bumper sticker a couple of years ago that said, "I'll believe a corporation is a person when Texas executes one." And
right.
And the fact of the matter is, prior to the 1890s, we actually did execute corporations routinely. In fact, most states didn't allow corporations to exist more than 30 or 40 years. And they had to reincorporate, under the supervision of the state. All that changed with the charter mongering era in the 1890s, which I don't think I get into in this book. There's a whole chapter about it in the original book back in 2002. The wonky book. This is a book for average people to read rather than lawyers. So yeah, I mean, that's where we're at right now. It's wild.
And you also argue that what we're seeing today about all the finger pointing at immigrants and poor people gaming the system, that sort of finger pointing that has become characteristic of the Republican Party, where Ronald Reagan came up with the idea of the welfare queen and defined her as a Black mother with multiple children driving a Cadillac and living in the projects collecting multiple checks. And so that fallacy started back then, but it's even more impactful now. And can you explain why they did that and how effective it is? Because it is what is holding the entire ceiling up in the current administration right now.
I agree. I call it the deflection strategy. And, a great way to illustrate it is a meme that probably most people have seen on the internet at one time or another, where you've got a fat cat guy, a big businessman sitting at a table with two guys, and he's got a giant pile of cookies in front of him on a plate, and each one of them has a plate with one cookie. And he turns to one guy and he points to the other guy, and he says to this one guy, "Look out, he wants your cookie." And yeah, and to add emphasis to it, one guy's black and one guy's white, and he's pointing to the black guy and saying he wants your cookie. And that's really the essence of Trumpism. That's the MAGA, and it's a great strategy. I mean, if you don't want people talking about why is it that we've gone from 2/3 of us being in the middle class with one paycheck to 1/3 of us, a little more than 1/3 of us being in the middle class with two paychecks. If you don't want people talking about that, then get them talking about, hey, look at that brown person, look at that black person, look at that queer person, look at that woman who, et cetera. I mean, misogyny, racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, all of it. It's all ways to change the subject very effectively, frankly, playing on the tribal instinct that we all have that was a survival instinct for the first couple 100,000 years of humanity. And so it's easily triggered, playing on that purely for political purposes, or when the corporations are funding it, basically to deflect attention away from them and towards somebody or something else.
Every candidate and politician that we talk to always talks about kitchen table issues, but those kitchen table issues revolve around access to healthcare and education and affordability. But media consolidation, that's not what they're putting out for people to talk about. So talk about that piece, because in your book you talked about how many media corporations there were in the past versus how many there are now.
Yeah, we've gone from 50 years ago about 50 or 70 major pieces of the media were owned by separate corporations to now we're down to a half a dozen basically, and it's not just the media. I wrote another book called The Hidden History of American Monopolies. There is literally no longer any industries of any consequence left in America that are not what are called monopsonies, which is where you have three, typically at the most five companies that dominate the entire industry, and even though they don't legally collude, they functionally do. If American Airlines raises rates $10, 30 minutes later, Delta has, and that sort of thing. They don't have to talk to each other. They just watch what everybody's doing. Although they probably are talking to each other at ALEC meetings and things.
Right.
So yeah, and again, this ability to merge. I mean, in 1983, Ronald Reagan ordered the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Department of Justice to basically stop enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, and the Antitrust Act of 1956. And they did. And so you may not be old enough to remember back in the 60s and 70s, I am, but back then, your downtowns were all local family-owned businesses. And your malls...
Old enough. We're old enough. We're in our 50s. So we were born in the 70s, early 70s. Yeah, okay. So we remember that.
I'm 20 years older than you, but the malls would have like one big national store, Sears to anchor it, but then every other business in there was a small locally owned business. And now they're just gone, and they're gone because of that decision that Reagan made. And I can't exactly say that decision tracks back to the predicate of Citizens United to the Santa Clara County, but frankly, I don't think Reagan would have become president without it. I don't, he wouldn't have had all that money to run his campaign and to cut a deal with the Iranians to hold on to the hostages to screw Jimmy Carter. I mean, so
right.
I digress.
Yeah. Well, and you've called Citizens United the culmination, not the beginning. So let's circle back to that, because we've talked about how Citizens United, the door was open for it to happen, but are corporate personhood and money is speech, and they're two different legal ideas, right? And how did these rights weaken unions in the middle class ultimately?
Yeah, the idea of money as speech was also invented by Republicans on the court, specifically Lewis Powell, and in the 70s, and there was a decision two years earlier than that, in 1976, called First National Bank versus Buckley versus Vallejo, where James Buckley, who was the brother of William F. Buckley, a very wealthy family, wanted to run for the Senate and wanted to fund his own campaign. And there were campaign finance laws, that had come out of the Nixon bribery scandals. And he couldn't do that. And so he sued, and it took it to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, okay, if you're rich, you can fund your own campaign, which is why today Republicans really love to recruit wealthy people who run for political office. People like Rick Scott is worth, what, $700 million?
Because they can self-fund.
Yeah, exactly. And there's no rules. I mean, there's no rules because of that decision. But applying that to corporations took a little bit of intellectual gymnastics, saying that, corporations can't, how does a corporation speak? Is it through their spokesperson? Well, that's a person speaking, not a corporation. So how does the corporate, well, it must speak with money. As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't have a mouth, it's got money. So they're two different doctrines, and yet they kind of work like that.
Okay. Let's play devil's advocate a little bit, because people often talk about, overturning Citizens United and the argument against corporate personhood. But we are a very litigious society, as is illustrated by the commander-in-chief right now and the frivolous lawsuits that are going on. So let's say I'm a corporation owner, and how do I protect myself from that constant suing from whomever, and what rights should a corporation legitimately have?
Well, in my opinion, if a corporation makes a decision that causes people to die or causes great harm, the consequence should not just be to the corporation. Traditionally, that has been the case. Ford with the exploding Pintos and side saddle gas tanks and stuff like that, for example, is probably the most famous example from back in that era. But generally speaking, that's not the case. Generally speaking, when a corporation makes a decision, or when a decision is made within a corporation and it leads to death or destruction or damage, the individuals are not held responsible. I would love to see, the senior executives and the former senior executives in particular at the big oil companies, for example, held to account for all the deaths that are happening right now as a result of global warming. It probably won't happen, but and this isn't entirely because of corporate personhood. It's also because we've just, our legal system has been progressive. I would say largely as a consequence of corporate personhood, our legal system has been progressively more and more captured by corporate interests and tilted toward corporate interests over, in particular, the last 50 years.
Well, and let's talk about the solution, because you do lay out a solution in the book, and that solution that you laid out is a constitutional amendment, which is a pretty that's a moonshot, right? I mean, it's not easy to amend the Constitution. And why don't we talk a little bit about that, about the because you actually wrote in the book, you included verbiage that should be included in that amendment. So let's talk about the amendment, the point, how, how it would serve to eliminate entities like Citizens United, but then also talk about the hurdles you would need to get over in order for that to be enacted.
Sure. And the constitutional amendment is the ultimate fix. But there are also some intermediate steps that we could take on the way to that. We can talk about if you'd like. But the constitutional
why don't you
amendment,
start with what you would start with first?
Yeah, let's start with I think Monica's right. We should probably talk about the immediate fixes first.
Well, for example, the For the People Act back in 2022, I think it was, that got sabotaged by Kirsten Gillibrand and Joe Manchin. Otherwise, it would have passed. That basically withdrew some of the powers that corporations had and rich individuals had, for that matter, in political campaigns from the Supreme Court decision. Article 3, which controls the judiciary of the Constitution, Section 2, says explicitly that Congress shall regulate the Supreme Court, and also can decide what the court can rule on and cannot rule on. And regulations and exceptions are the two magic words there. You can read it, Article 3, Section 2. It's unambiguous. And so Congress, and in fact, when John Roberts was working in the Reagan administration, this is in a different one of my books, The Hidden History of Neoliberalism, Roberts wrote a 28-page memo to Reagan talking about how using Article 3, Section 2, they could blow up the Roe v. Wade decision by simply saying that the Supreme Court may no longer decide issues of abortion. All they had to do was pass a piece of legislation with a simple majority in the House, and if you can get through the filibuster in the Senate, or maybe you can even get a simple majority, and that would be the end of Roe v. Wade, and then you could outlaw abortion. And Roberts was all gung ho.
As if we need another reason to think Roberts is more of a schmuck, right? Like
Right.
he had been planning this clearly for years. This whole Roe v. Wade
Playing
thing.
the long game for
Oh
sure.
yeah, absolutely. And not just that, he's also been planning Citizens United for years. I mean, again, you go back to his papers from when he was, a senior official in the Reagan Justice Department, and very, very tight with guys in the White House. So anyway, I forgot where I was going with that.
I'm sorry.
Oh, what can we do? Yeah, Congress could simply pass a law saying, here are new restrictions. We we dare you to challenge this, or we're going to actually argue specifically. We're going to put it into law. The Supreme Court may not make decisions about whether corporate personhood is a thing. You can't do it. And, that has never been tested. But in the 1980s, there were over 100 pieces of legislation, all of them introduced by Republicans, several of them with correspondence with John Roberts, including court stripping provisions like this. And there have been at least a half a dozen that have made it into law, where there is a provision in the law that says the Supreme Court may not rule on this. So that would be one way to do it. You can nibble around the edges, you could take it head on, or you could do the constitutional amendment. And the constitutional amendment part, what's interesting is as you point out, the constitutional amendments are a big lift. They require 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of the states to ratify. And we've only had, fewer than 30 of them since the founding of the Republic. And there have been 27,000 that have been actually proposed by Congress during all those years. Yeah, it really is. Most of them never got a vote, but I mean, there's, somebody did the research on that, and it's a mind-boggling number. But on the other hand, I remember, I forget the year, but when Barry McGuire's song, The Eve of Destruction, Sherrod Brown loves to talk about this. It was his favorite song. Barry McGuire sang this song, Eve of Destruction, which had a line in it, "You're old enough to kill, but not for voting." It was an anti-war song. And that resonated so loudly across America that Congress proposed a constitutional amendment that said that we'll lower the voting age from 21 to 18. It passed Congress in a couple of weeks. It went out to the states, and within 4 months, it had been ratified by 3/4 of the states and put into the Constitution. So the total time there was 4, maybe 5 at the most months from beginning to end. So, and the reason why, of course, was because well over 70 or 80% of Americans thought that it was inappropriate that we should be sending our young men off to Vietnam to die when they couldn't even vote on the people who were sending them to war. And we just finally reached a consensus on that. Well, right now, the polling shows that like 85 to 90% of all Americans, 90% of Democrats, 75% of Republicans say there's too much money in politics. It shouldn't be there. We need to get rid of it. So I think that if we could just get, at least one political party, and you know which one I'm talking about, to say, yes, this is going to be our issue. And let's start talking about all the damage that this corporate personhood BS is causing. And it's not even grounded in actual law or the Constitution. In fact, it's antithetical to the Constitution. It's the opposite of what the founders were saying. Then I think that it may not be as big a lift as we think.
I keep referring to data centers as the unicorn that is unifying both parties. Nobody in either party is in favor of these big data centers in their backyard, but I think we may have found a second unicorn in this getting money out of politics. And what is your view of the likelihood of such an amendment passing, given the support that you see from the voters?
Well, sometimes it's useful to have a lever, a wedge to pop something off. And the data centers could be it, because they are the reason the data centers are happening is because these corporations, these big, IT corporations, these big AI corporations are coming in and they're paying off politicians. They're giving them money, and they're giving them money because they have corporate personhood. So, hey, you don't want corporations buying off your mayor and your town council or your governor or your legislature. All you had to do is just do away with corporate personhood and we can go back. Teddy Roosevelt in 1908 got the Tillman Act passed. The Tillman Act made it a federal felony for any corporation to give any money, assistance, personnel to help any political campaign for federal office in any way. And that stood right up until it got struck down by Citizens United. We could go back to the Tillman Act. And just say, sorry, AI guys, it's going to be up to the local community. I mean, it would be a great, way to kind of lever that thing in. There are other ways, of course, as well, but I think I think Americans are so fed up, so disgusted by what's going on. I think that they've been just begging for genuine change, a genuine New Deal. And frankly, I think that's why that's why Trump was elected in 2016. I think it's a large part of it was because he was singing that song. He was like, I'm going to slap around the Republicans. I'm going to slap around I'm going to change things. It's why Obama was elected, hope and change, right? And we didn't quite get all the change that we wanted. We got a lot of hope, and he did a pretty good job. But I think that the pressure at that point was like here, and now it's like here.
It's exponential. Now.
Yeah, it really is.
You know what I find really fascinating? So we interviewed Todd Achilles last week. He's an independent running in Idaho. And we're actually, I think on Wednesday, we're interviewing Seth Bodnar. And we'll also be interviewing Brian Banks. These are all independent candidates in states that have been kind of written off by the Democratic Party. Brian Banks is in South Dakota. Todd Achilles is in Idaho. Monica, what state? I keep getting it mixed up between
Montana.
Wyoming.
Seth is in Montana. Yeah.
Seth is in Montana. And in some of these races, in the case of Brian in South Dakota and Todd in Idaho, the Democrat has dropped out so that the voting can coalesce.
Right.
And it's working. And when we talked to Todd last week about, Monica asked him a really poignant question, who will you caucus with? And he said, I'm going to caucus as an independent. And these other independents in his cohort are planning on caucusing as independents, because he brought up a very good point, another point about Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt held that power is found in the middle. It is sustained and it remains in the middle. And these independents very possibly could be sitting in a row in the middle of the Senate, forcing bipartisanship, forcing and denying both parties a majority. Yeah. And this may be what you're looking for there for this to happen.
It could be. And Bernie Sanders kind of pioneered the I can be a successful independent thing, decades ago.
Right.
Mentioning Montana, though, reminds me of a third way to deal with Citizens United that I did not know about when I wrote the book, and just have learned about in the last month or two, or 3 or 4. And that is Montana has a ballot initiative that'll be on the November ballot, and Hawaii has already passed legislation to control corporate spending in politics. And the way that they're doing it is through state corporate charter laws. Corporations, most people who've never started a company don't understand how this works. But if you want to start a company, you don't go to the federal government. You go to your local state government, and they give you what's called a corporate charter. They authorize you to do business in the state, and some states are more or less restrictive, and there's some rules and all this kind of stuff. But basically, the state controls what corporations can and cannot do. And so Hawaii just passed a law that said that corporations can't participate in politics. And, in Montana, like I said, has a very similar law that's going to be voted on in November. And I'm expecting that particularly if there's a blue wave this fall, and in fact, a progressive wave, that you're going to see particularly in the blue states, you're going to see that kind of legislation popping up all over the place. And it'll be tested by the Supreme Court, of course, but I think it can be very effective.
Montana is very interesting that way, and their history of how they have put their senators in place and how that changed through history.
Oh, Cooper. Yeah.
You can't really peg them down like in any particular way. So they're an interesting state. So I'll be interested to see how that legislation goes too.
Yeah, I mean, that was Montana, I believe, was the state that led to the amendment to the Constitution that allowed for direct election of senators, because this copper baron named Cooper, who literally stood outside the Montana legislature with envelopes with $1,000 bills in them and passed them out to people who voted for him for senator. And that corruption, made headlines and outraged the state and led to a big change.
So you took the time to write this book, and I'm going to put a plug for it because it is only about 200 pages. It's a relatively quick read. It's also very entertaining, and there's I was a history major in college, so all of that stuff fascinates me. So maybe it's not going to tickle everybody's fancy, but I found it very compelling and had no problem getting through it. But what is your hope with presenting this information to the public in, not an academic way, but in, as you said, in a much more easily digested way, in a more accessible way? What are you hoping the public will get out of this? And what would be like your ideal outcome with that?
Well, in 2002, when I wrote Unequal Protection, I thought, oh my God, look at what I've discovered, what we have here, and here's a couple of people who discovered it before me, but just it never even broke through into law schools, much less anything else. In the 24 years since then, it has broken through. So, well, it's interesting. I wrote an article about this a couple of weeks ago. I asked a couple of different AIs. I went to DuckDuckGo and asked its AI, is it true that in 1886 the Supreme Court established corporate personhood? And it said yes. And in fact, it quoted the headnote. And then I went to ChatGPT and I asked the same question, and it said, no, the headnote was not part of the legal record. So, so there's still like this weird thing going on. And so after my last book was published, the publisher called up and said, we'd like you to do another book for us. And Louise and I my wife and I, my partner in crime here, we were debating, what should it be? And we thought, Unequal Protection was really a good book. I put a hell of a lot of work into that book. It was groundbreaking stuff. And it never really hit it's a 300-page book, and it's written, and it's written like an academic tome. It's so let's rewrite it as a murder mystery. Who killed the American dream? Who was the hitman?
I love that.
Right? Who pulled the trigger? Who paid off the hitman? And so this book, as you both know, having read it, is organized like a murder mystery. And so my goal was just to reach as many people as possible, because if we're going to have a constitutional amendment, we have to have that same groundswell of support that we had back in the whatever year that was, the 70s, I think it was, when the constitutional amendment was passed that lowered the voting age. So,
right.
We mentioned before we started recording that I follow Heather Cox Richardson, and I love how she ties history into current events and how it has led to how we've gotten here. And I love that your book is laid out the same way to show us how we got here. So where can listeners find the book, find your program, and information about the amendment campaign?
The amendment campaign, probably the two organizations that have been most high profile in the amendment campaign are movetoamend.org and the organization that Ralph Nader started, publiccitizen.org. And they both, I think they pretty much agreed on pretty much the same amendment, or very, very similar language. And that basically says money is not speech, corporations are not persons, and the Supreme Court can't say that they are. So that's, in terms of finding the book, it's in any bookstore. It's distributed by, I think, Penguin, I think. I'm forgetting.
Yeah, it's Penguin.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And, so they've got good distribution. It's everywhere. And I've written a number of articles about this over at hartmannreport.com, which is my main platform for writing every day. And if you just plug my name or hartmannreport.com and Citizens United or and 1886 into any search engine. They'll pop right up, and you'll have all the details, and you'll have the links and everything else. And my program is on the air 9 a.m. to noon Pacific time, noon to 3 Eastern time. Nationwide, we're on Sirius XM, we're on Free Speech TV, we're on Dish and Direct and Roku, and it's live on Facebook Live and Twitter and Substack, and it's just kind of all over the place. And we're on a couple hundred radio stations around the country too.
You are all over the place.
You're everywhere. You're everywhere all at once. And I'm going to make sure to include that information in the show notes. But we have one question that we ask all of our guests. Okay. And it's a question that Monica and I always look forward to hearing the answer to. What is giving you hope right now?
What is giving me hope is young people. I wrote a book called The Hidden History of the American Dream, and it was specifically written to Zoomers. In fact, the title should have said that. They have figured out, there's not a Zoomer I've ever met who doesn't realize that they got the short end of the stick, that they got screwed, and that it's Reaganomics that screwed them. 45 years of Reaganomics. And the failure of the Democrats to successfully push back on this, not because they're bad people or anything. I mean, there's this whole political dynamics around this, not to mention mind-boggling amounts of money. And of course, the Republicans are just gung-ho for it because they're all fully enthralled to the corporations. So this generation coming up just continually blows my mind. I see them, I'm a boomer, and we were a very activist generation. I got arrested a couple times back in the 60s in anti-war protests and civil rights.
There's another podcast right there.
Right?
and I mean, I was in SDS at MSU, and I think that this generation is like bringing that back. Frankly, I think it's like Strauss and Howe. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the fourth turning, this whole concept of 4 generations that keep repeating themselves throughout American history. I've mentioned that in a couple of my books, but I really think that we're in the fourth turning, that it's coming back around, that this is the end of one of those 80-year cycles, and we're about to enter a very positive, progressive phase. I don't think it's going to be easy. I think it's going to be really brutal. And I think that the Trump in particular and the Republicans around him are going to do everything, and the corporations that support them are going to do everything they can to fight it. But I'm feeling a tidal wave here. I hope you are too.
We are too.
We sure hope so. And we have heard from many guests about how the young generation is what is giving them hope. And I believe that there are more of us that think the way that we do than there are of them. And I really hope that you're right, that this is the tide turning.
Yeah.
Me too.
Thom, thank you so much for joining us today. It was fascinating. I mean, anytime I can talk about history and historical events with someone like that, I get giddy. So thank you so much for being on today. And thank you for leaving us with something larger than just a diagnosis. You've got a concrete argument about how citizens can begin rebuilding the political and economic power in this country. And I think that this is such a great book. I cannot recommend it enough. And I will put information about the book and where you can find it in the show notes as well. So thank you so
Christy.
much.
Thank you, Monica. It's just been an honor and a pleasure to hang out here with you and talk about this.
It's truly our honor. Thank you. To our listeners, if you are finding meaning in the stories we're sharing, if something moves you, challenges you, makes you see the world a little differently, please like, comment, and share. It helps more than you know.
And follow us everywhere at The Politics Chicks on Substack, Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook.
Thanks for being a part of our community. Keep shining your light so we can find each other in the dark.
And remember, we're stronger together. Thanks again, Thom. This was such a great interview.